All right, you guys got a little flash preview there of what's going on here, but I am your host, Alejandro Rojas, for this hour. This is Open Mind UFO Radio, one of my Rojas Reports interview, and I'm very excited to have with me author and New York Times writer Ralph Blumenthal. Thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure, Alejandro. Thank you.
So your December 2017 article, this is the first time I've got to talk to you since that's come out. But wow, it's really changed how the world thinks of this topic, I think. How do you feel about the reaction and the results of that article?
Well, very gratified. I mean, I had a chance with my colleagues, Leslie Kane and Helene Cooper, to put this story into the mainstream media. I've been in the shadows far too long. We had a great tip. I mean, we knew that we found out that there was a secret Pentagon office, ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, operating to track UFOs. And officially, as you know, the government was out of the UFO business with Project Blue Book in 1970. So, 50 years later, almost 50 years later, we found what was pretty well known, actually, in the UFO community, that the government was still interested. And what they didn't know was that there was this Pentagon office that was tracking these things with a $22 million appropriation from Harry Reid. So we had the whole story. And actually, we found out that Lou Elizondo, who'd been heading that program, had just resigned because he wasn't getting enough support, he said, from the government, from the Pentagon. So we had that piece of it exclusively. And, people ask me often, well, how did you deal with your Times editors? Were they hard to deal with? Absolutely not. They saw the story right away. It was a solidly reported story. We had everybody on the record, no secret sources, no anonymous, voices. So it got in right away. It got in on a Sunday front page. So it did have a big effect.
How did you first come across the information? Did Leslie bring it to you, or had you spoken with Chris Mellon or Lou Elizondo?
Leslie brought it to me. I knew Leslie because I've been working on this book about John Mack since 2004. So I knew Leslie, and because she'd written this, best-selling book on UFOs. And so she told me she was going down to Washington to meet with some people, and who she met with, it turns out, was Lou Elizondo and some other people. And she got directly from them the story about how he was quitting ATIP. That, first of all, that ATIP existed, that there was such a thing as ATIP, that the Pentagon was interested in UFOs, that, through ATIP, and that Lou Elizondo was quitting. So she came back from Washington with that story and told me, and I had the contacts at the New York Times because I'd been a Times reporter since from 1964 to 2009. When I retired from the staff, but I continued to contribute. So anyway, I still had my contacts at the time. So I said that we got a blockbuster story. I didn't even tell them what the story was. I just said, we got a story that's going to change a lot of things. And they said, by all means, come in and talk to us. So that's how it started.
I should mention this, and I apologize for not mentioning this at the top. You also have a brand new book out, and what we're kind of setting the stage for these New York Times articles, and we'll definitely be covering that, about John Mack. And the name of the book is The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. So a lot of people are really excited about the book, and we'll talk about that at length, no doubt. With the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP, finding out that the Pentagon actually had this project going on, it was surprising for a lot of people, most especially the many people who had been following, like Robert Bigelow, who was contracted for that program, and what he's been up to the last few years. And most of us, if not all of us, none of us had a clue what was going on. What was your reaction when Leslie shared that information with you?
Well, I was stunned. I mean, as I said, I hadn't been following it day to day, but what I knew about, the Pentagon was that it always had taken an arm's length, position with UFOs, that officially it was very skeptical, but I knew that, deep down, there were a lot of people in the Pentagon, the Air Force, and the Navy who took this very seriously. And as somebody said to me for my book, the higher you go, in the Air Force, the more people are convinced of the existence of these UFOs. So it was not a big surprise that the government had an interest in it. What was surprising was that they had this organization which had managed to stay secret for so long. It had an appropriation of $22 million from Senator's Majority Leader Harry Reid. That was a secret. That Robert Bigelow was the contractor. That was a secret. So I was stunned to hear these details.
Mm-hmm. And, Lou Elizondo has kind of said what he provided was UFO disclosure. He's framed it that way. And some people agree. Some people are still saying, oh, no, this is just the tip of it. There's more disclosure coming. What is UFO disclosure to you, if you even use that term? And do you feel that it was accomplished with your article?
Well, it's a complicated question you just raised, and a lot of parts to it. The word disclosure is thrown around a lot, and there are a lot of people out there, aficionados, fans who feel that the government is one step away from disclosure, that it's some process that is like foreordained, that the government is taking a lot of conspiratorial steps to open the way, that the quote leaking of the information to us was the first step in disclosure. I mean, that's nonsense as far as I'm concerned, because I know how hard we worked to get that story. It was not spoon-fed to us, and it could have taken many different turns depending on how we did our reporting. So it was not a leak to pave the way for full disclosure. I think that's illusory. I don't think the government, given the secrets that that we think it possesses, I don't think the government is prepared to fully open its books on what it knows. First of all, there's so many corners of the government. It's balkanized, as somebody recently told us, to the point where one program doesn't know what another program is doing, and nor should it, perhaps, in order to keep the secrecy. So there's so many compartments there, and it's involved in so much secrecy, particularly because it impacts the defense situation. What we know is something that our adversaries would like to know. And so there are some good reasons why the government is secretive, but on the larger issues of do UFOs exist? How much has the government tracked them? That information, I think, should have been shared more openly with the public. We're ready to handle it, despite what some government officials thought at the time. The American people couldn't handle, the truth. As the movie line goes, you can't handle the truth. We can. So, but again, to answer your question, I don't think it's part of some deep, dark formula to open the way, which may never come, or may not come for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And I think the government's reaction to your article was evidence of what you're saying, in that the immediate reaction was to deny many of the facts you presented, although all these years later, the story's really held up. I think your reporting has proven to be more accurate than those denials at the DOD.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we heard was quickly on, that program, now that the Times identified the ATIP program, that program is discontinued. It shut down some time ago. Well, we found out from our very good sources who provided us the information in the first place that it did not shut down, that it was still going, and as a matter of fact continues to this day under a new name, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force. So, and that's common in the government, when just give it a new name and pretend, something changed. So when you go back through the history, and when I did my book, by the way, I went back through the entire history of the UFO awareness program in the government, and it came under so many different names: Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Signal, Blue Book. You name it, the government had a name for it, but it was always the same thing in different form.
Mm-hmm. So in 2020, you all did kind of a follow-up story, and where there's much anticipated in the UFO community, where there's a lot of speculation and what would be covered in the story. And I was very skeptical of that speculation because many thought you were going to uncover, the new disclosure about crashed UFO retrievals. But I was surprised that you all did go there. You had spoken with Dr. Eric Davis, who was one of the scientists working with Bigelow. I've interviewed him on this topic at length as well. And, he certainly is under the impression, I gather from kind of the buzz around the scientific community he works with, that there were crash retrieval programs. I guess, what was the goal of the article in your mind, including that information?
Okay, I want to be very careful here because I want to say just what we were able to report in the New York Times and not really open the door to a lot of back and forth that goes into this reporting. So first of all, we had it on very solid authority that members of Congress had been briefed, or certainly congressional committees and staff had been briefed about materials that had been recovered, supposedly recovered. And rather than get into the question of, what materials have been recovered and, where and how much, we stuck pretty closely to the facts we knew, which were that there were these briefings, and Eric Davis told us he was part of them, where congressional committees and staff were told what information the government possessed. Now, the problem is that information is largely classified. And we can't deal with classified information because we don't want to be arrested. And there's a law about that. Information is classified for a reason. So we were not about to, disclose classified information, even if we were able to get it, which was very problematic. So we stuck to what we knew, which was that we had briefing slides, one of which we put in the Times later after that article in connection with a story about our reporting, Leslie and I, and what people ask what you believe, and we say it's not a question of what we believe, it's a question of what we know and can report. So anyway, in connection with that story, we published a slide, which we had, showing how congressional committees were briefed on things mentioning materials. Now, there were not many details, but just the fact that materials were mentioned and retrievals were referenced, gave it some credibility. And that's really as far as we were able to go. We did not go into speculation and all the stories that are around, anecdotal stories about, crashes and bodies being taken away for analysis and things like that, because we don't have the evidence of that. We have stories, but nothing that we feel comfortable with. So, but I think it moved the needle. And, there was a lot of speculation, as you mentioned, about what is the Times going to report and when are they going to tell the whole story. And we're only comfortable telling the stories as far as we can, document it and verify it. We hear a lot of things. We don't put everything we hear in the paper. So it's a difficult process, and the Times has very high standards. So we were happy with that story, the way it came out.
Mm-hmm. I think Chris Mellon confirmed, what you reported, because there was some doubt. And soon after, I think in a CNN interview, he confirmed that was accurate, that, Dr. Davis was with you all. And he framed it that, Davis was able to give them some leads. And I thought that seemed like an accurate way to frame it, in that he was providing them what he knew. And to your point, which is a fascinating idea, that this topic came up in these briefings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the news, that um, we were able to document that actually members of Congress, committees, and staff were briefed on these matters. So, you say, well, if it gets to that point, then it's pretty solid information. And again, we don't know, we don't have the content of the briefing. We have a slide that refers to certain things, and even that the mention of that was newsworthy. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a breakthrough, and it was as far as we were able to go.
Mm-hmm. So your article has now resulted in this conversation, being taken place and in a somewhat public manner in Washington. Even in the last couple of, well, maybe in the last week or two, we've had Marco Rubio on TV talking about it, a former director for national intelligence talking about it in a serious manner, saying these are serious situations. This is a serious issue that we need to take seriously. Is that surprising to you that your article is able to have that much impact?
Well, I don't want to exaggerate what we were able to do. I think we tuned into something that was around in the government, all along. We amplified it. We gave it more credibility in the mainstream media. I don't want to take credit for everything that's happened since then is something we did, but it certainly moved along after that. And now this ATIP, successor is the UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force, and by congressional mandate, they have to deliver a report. It was supposed to be 180 days after the Defense Authorization Act in December, so that would be give us a date of June sometime. But as Senator Rubio and others have said publicly since then, it may not come in on time. It may be delayed. There's no, magic with that date. I mean, it's in the Congression, it's in the bill. But deadlines often slip in Washington, and we know how hard it is to do things. So it would not be surprising, a lot of people have said, if that date slips. But so if it comes in 3 or 6 months later, it'll still be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that even if, I think maybe there was a recent article in Politico by Brian Bender, an interview with Chris Mellon, and Chris Mellon seems frustrated that a lot of agencies don't seem to be taking this mandate seriously. But even that this conversation is happening, and now the conversation is out there at this level, I think is incredibly significant. And it means it's not going away.
Yeah. I meant to mention, Alejandro, in connection with the article in December 2017 that we did in the Times, we were also able to release on the Times webpage videos of the Navy encounters with these objects. And I think that was an extremely important part of the story, because it wasn't just the words that said, ATIP existed and this is what they're doing, but we actually had the videos of radar sightings or impressions and, gun camera imaging of these objects moving at incredibly fast speeds around Navy jets. And then in a subsequent story, we actually had interviews with the pilots talking about what they had seen and what they saw on radar and what they saw with their own eyes. So those videos have, gone around the world. They're still the most watched things we've put up on the Times website. They're amazing. Every time you look at them, your breath gets taken away again, because it's actually there physically to see. And I think that was a big factor in the impact that we had.
Mm-hmm. Right. You were the first to release those. I think now Chris Mellon has admitted he was the leaker, and that although he said he had to bend some rules, he doesn't have any regrets. But with those videos, the Navy's backed them to say that those are genuine unknowns. We don't know what they are. You've talked to some of the pilots, radar people who were involved with those incidents, who say they agree. We don't know what these are. Yet there's kind of a strong outcry publicly that, certain reporters, I've been accused of this, and I'm sure, that, you're ignoring other information that demonstrate that those are mundane, that the Navy has it wrong. How do you feel about, kind of this large audience of people that are demanding that they know what's in those videos and that it's birds or balloons or what have you, and that
Well,
the Navy has it wrong?
I wish they'd tell me if they know, because the truth is nobody knows. Nobody on Earth knows what those objects are. And this is what gets me, Alejandro. When people say, do you believe in UFOs? That is a really silly question, because it's like saying, do you believe in the moon? Do you believe in the stars, or do you believe in the ocean? The fact that objects are there is beyond question. It's not something to believe in, like God. It's not a matter of opinion. Objects exist. The real question and the mystery is what they are. But they are physical substance. They're physical objects. We know that now because they've been captured on these imaging devices. And that's a big step in itself, because for a very long time, people were saying, well, these are spiritual constructs. These are archetypes. These are things, emanating from the human mind. They don't really exist. Well, they do exist. And now there are people saying, well, they're balloons, or they're this or that. Too many accounts have come out. There's too much evidence to suggest that they are what they seem to be: blobs of light, moving objects, physical objects. So, I wish these so-called skeptics and debunkers would do their homework and read the material, because it's very easy to stand on the sidelines and say, this is nuts, or these people are demented, or anyone reporting this is crazy. It's easy to say that without having any information. But if you do the work, and work is involved, you have to read the literature, you have to read the reports, you gain a new, appreciation and understanding and some humility for the subject. And I must say, researching my book on John Mack, the more I researched and went into it, the more confused I became. So it's not like it's not a process of resolving the doubts. It's a process almost of getting, more confused. But at least I tell people, I know what the phenomenon is not. So it's not mental illness. It's not insanity. It's not fabrication, by and large, not hoaxes, although there have been hoaxes. It's something else.
So that's a good transition. Let's get into the book, and I want to bring up your website just so people can see that. A good place to get it. And here we go. And your website is ralphblumenthal.com here.
Yep. There
we go. People can see it there. So John Mack, you said you've been working on this book for quite some time, since 2004. He's my last interview, I mentioned this before, was with Avi Loeb, another Harvard professor. But John Mack was a Harvard professor looking into the possibility of alien abduction decades ago. What originally got you interested in him and his work?
Good question. I fell into it when I picked up a copy of his book, his second book, John Mack's second book, called Passport to the Cosmos. I was a correspondent in Texas for the New York Times, and I picked up a used book. Never heard of John Mack before. And I read the book. I saw it was a Harvard psychiatrist who was doing research in people who came forward with accounts of being abducted by aliens, and had vivid accounts of being beamed onto ships and having reproductive experiments and having their eggs and semen taken to produce a hybrid race. I mean, these were all their stories. And John Mack investigated, and he was an esteemed psychiatrist. The stories were interesting to him. So right then and there, I thought that was extraordinary. So I thought, in my naivete, I'm going to give this guy a call and maybe do a story about him. I had no idea how famous he already was. He had been on Oprah. He had written these two, books. He'd met with the Dalai Lama to discuss aliens. He'd done a lot of things, but I didn't know about it. So I was going to call him to see if I could arrange an interview, and I pick up the paper a few days later, and he was dead. He'd been run down in London. He'd gone there for a conference on Lawrence of Arabia. He had done a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of T.E. Lawrence. He came out of the underground one night, looked the wrong way, as tourists do in London, and got run down by a man who had too much to drink. A lot of people thought he was assassinated. The conspiracy stories flourished, but I proved that that's not true. I read the police reports. Anyway, so that's how I got interested. I then contacted the family and I said I'd like to, get access to his papers and his archives and his work, and see if I could do a longer story or maybe a book. And they gave me that access with no strings attached. And so that's how it happened. That's how I got interested.
Now, from looking into the phenomena, the abduction phenomena, what I found fascinating, because I was skeptical. I didn't really want to go there when I originally started getting interested in looking into this topic. But there were so many people that came to me, and I guess that's what was surprising to me when I found there are so many people that believe they're experiencing this. If you were to try to put a number on it, do you think there are maybe hundreds of thousands of people that believe this is happening to them, more or less?
Well, Alejandro, I mean, Bob Bigelow financed a poll for John Mack. I tell that story in my book early on, and they got very few people. First of all, you can't go around asking people, have you ever been abducted? Because you wouldn't get a very good answer. So they had to come up with these questions like, have you woken up during the night in the presence of strange creatures? Have you ever felt you were flying? These so-called threshold questions. So from that, they extrapolated a huge number of like 4 million people. 4 million Americans have been abducted, they concluded. Well, that resulted in a storm of controversy because other people said, well, that's totally ridiculous. If 4 million people have been abducted, we know about it. We'd know a lot more about it. So the answer is we don't know. But what's interesting, and maybe we should talk about this a little bit, is why John Mack believed so much that he was onto something. I was going to say believed in their stories, but that's a dangerous area to get into, what he actually believed as far as what was really happening. He certainly believed that something was going on some level of reality, something actually real. And what made him think that was a bunch of things. First of all, some of these accounts that people came to him with, they were generally coherent accounts. I mean, people told the same basic story, whether they were young, old, wherever, men, women, professional people, educated people, ordinary people, housewives, everybody, a cross-section told basically the same story with enough variation so it wasn't a script. They were shy about coming forward, so they weren't looking to have their stories publicized. They didn't only happen at night. It was not, John Mack had written a book on nightmares, so he knew what nightmares were. These didn't only happen at night. Happened while people were driving in their cars. It happened when they were walking in the countryside. It happened, in one case, a woman was on a snowmobile. So these experiences happened in different ways, and they were often consciously remembered up to a point. Then he used hypnosis to draw out more details. So it was not a construct of hypnosis. Then they occurred to children as young as 2 years old. Kids would say, little man, take me up to the sky. I fly in the sky. And, of course, these children were not reciting books they had read or movies they had seen. They're 2 years old. And finally, some of the people had scoop marks on them, scars they couldn't explain. They never remember how they got, that kind of thing. So John followed a trail of evidence, and he he eliminated a number of things very quickly. He said, look, I'm a psychiatrist. I know when people are insane. These people are definitely not mentally ill. And they're not making up stories. They're not fabricating, all the reasons I just said. So he eliminated all the other possibilities, and he was left with the idea that somehow something had happened to these people that penetrated their reality.
and he's not the first in that, just that they're supporting material. So, for instance, Dr. Leo Sprinkle out of the University of Wyoming, another professor, had also done some inventories to show that these people weren't crazy, that they were
Right.
stable people, they're professionals in many cases. And it seems that kind of like you've kind of were part of busting the taboo for the UFO topic. That is kind of another taboo, an irrational kind of blind spot in that, sure, it seems weird and maybe that's what they believe is happening to them isn't what's happening to them. But why are we ignoring, potentially hundreds of thousands, if not more, people who are having these, what they feel are traumatic experiences? Why are we ignoring this phenomena? It seems like
Well,
the
yeah,
responsible thing to do would be to at least look into it and try to help these people.
you're right. It would be, but the leap from UFOs to aliens is a big one. And while you can get people to acknowledge that there may be things flying in the sky that we don't understand, and we actually have pictures, and now we have Navy videos of that, that's one thing. There are no Navy videos of aliens that I'm aware of. As a matter of fact, every attempt to get evidence of aliens, cameras set up in the bedroom at night with tripwires and all these things, they don't produce anything or anything at all or very much. The phenomenon, whatever it is, has a way of frustrating that kind of evidence gathering. So whereas UFOs are a relatively easy thing to convince people of, given what we found out so far, aliens are much harder because there's just not the evidence. There's anecdotal evidence, which was quite compelling to John Mack because he talked to these people, but to somebody who has never had an abduction experience, and I never have, I've never seen a UFO, so I'm pure like John Mack. He didn't either. To outsiders who hear these stories, they say, well, that's impossible. I can't imagine. It's never happened to me. I can't imagine it happening. So that's a big threshold to cross. And you're right. It would be good if people took that more seriously, at least try to understand what was behind that phenomenon, because it does affect quite a few people, more than you'd think.
Mm-hmm. And he seemed to feel, and I think that this is kind of a key, seemed to feel it was a non-physical phenomena, that it was, but there was genuinely some third party involvement. Is that a correct framing?
Yeah, that's well said. I mean, John changed his view over time. In the beginning, when he heard about the phenomenon from Bud Hopkins, who was a pioneer in the field, he was an artist who, before John Mack ever got into it, Bud Hopkins was writing books and hypnotizing people. He taught himself hypnosis. He took it very seriously to investigate this. And he and David Jacobs, a professor who also became one of the pioneers of this field in terms of interviewing and researching people and conducting hypnosis. Hopkins and Jacobs felt absolutely that this was a real phenomenon in physical reality, that the aliens were somehow evil. They were bent on taking human DNA for reproduction and hybrid, creation of a hybrid race. Speculative, but that's what the accounts of the people seem to point to. And John Mack, while he was more on that side when he started, increasingly began to think that there was something more spiritual involved, that it may not be happening in our reality because it defied, proof and evidence. And also that the people emerged with spiritual awareness through these experiences. They had a much more of an appreciation for protecting the earth, for being aware of a benign intelligence in the universe, a deity. They felt elevated by their experience as well as traumatized. They felt traumatized for sure because they were subject to, they lost their power. These beings, whatever they were or however it happened, it took them over. They lost their free will, but they also emerged with a sympathy for these beings in some strange way. They felt that they were lost or trying to, save their own planet or whatever. Anyway, and that differentiated John Mack from Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs. So they had kind of a parting of the ways. They reconciled later, but that's a good way to think of their different approaches.
Well, and I think it's an important concept too, in that, even getting back to those Navy videos, the performance, the movement, the science, the physics behind what we're seeing, when it comes to a physical matter, is not possible. I mean, the Scientific Coalition for UFOs, for instance, worked with Dr. Kevin Knuth and put together a paper where the massive amounts of energy that would be required for these objects to move quickly. So I think this concept of the non-physical and potential non-physical aspects of this phenomena is really important, and something that, we should probably take more seriously as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting divide between the physical and non-physical. The Navy videos point to a physicality, and that means that they have a technology to do this. In other words, it's not infinite possibility because they exist in the spiritual realm, and in spirit you can do anything. You're not bound by physical laws. On the contrary, these objects, whatever they are, wherever they come from, whoever's behind the wheel, are capable of technology that we don't understand. We'd love to get, by the way. I mean, I think there's a lot of effort being expended by private contractors and government scientists to try to figure out, since these things do seem to exist physically, what is the secret of their technology? How do they travel so quickly and move so fast and cloak themselves with invisibility? All these things. So, there's more and more, I think, emphasis on the physical.
And a couple of questions from the chat. Here's one. Is Mary Grace Kirby is asking, and again, thank you all so much for joining us live. If you have questions, get them in there. But yeah, if you could put question all in caps so I can see it, it's very helpful. Mary Grace Kirby, thank you for joining. She asks, is there anyone today in the psychiatric field like John Mack that interviews experiencers and takes them seriously, documents the accounts, and helps them?
Good question. I'm sure there are people. I mean, there were other people like John who didn't get the kind of attention he got, but who were also seeing patients or subjects. He could never decide whether they were patients or subjects. And it does remain a kind of an amorphous concept. But there were others. Some of them are in my book. And they came to different conclusions, by the way. This is what makes the field so interesting. Not everybody came across the same core abduction experience. Some researchers, psychiatrists like John Mack, came away saying, my people don't tell me that they were subject to reproductive procedures to create a hybrid race. And my people tell me that's really a minimal part of what they experienced. A lot of the stories don't fit, the standard, the template, the so-called core abduction experience. But to answer your question directly, I don't know them all, obviously, but there are psychiatrists who are dealing with this. The field is not dead. As a matter of fact, John Mack opened up the understanding to the point where people are not necessarily dismissed as crazy. So I know there are experiencer help groups around, where they meet and share experiences. So they would know of, other psychiatrists are working with people like that.
Mm-hmm. And just a couple of names I know. Barbara Lamb, she is a marriage and family therapist who covers this. And then Yvonne Smith, who's a PTSD therapist who helps people with these situations.
Well, funny you mentioned Barbara. I interviewed Barbara for my book, and I spoke to her recently. She was part of a group in San Diego I did a Zoom with. And she had a experience of encountering John Mack after he died. And that's a section of my book at the very end, and I put it at the end because I said, I can't vouch for this the way I can vouch for other stuff in the book, but these are stories people tell. about encountering John Mack after he died, and Barbara was one of them. So the story gets stranger and stranger, but Barbara Lamb definitely is one of the people working with experiencers.
Here's another question. Tim is asking, why does it have to be extraterrestrial and not terrestrial species that remains hidden, that has survived longer than us here and has grown technologically beyond us?
Well, it's a good question. There are lots of accounts of undersea bases and, caves in mountains where, beings, portals, let's say, to another world. So as long as we don't know anything about where the aliens come from, even if they exist, we might as well speculate that they could also come from Earth, that they're living among us, that it's not necessarily a physical divide. So one of the experiences I quote in my book said also that as far as the great distances that the aliens supposedly have to travel to get here, she said space is curved, which we know from Einstein. Space is curved, and she had a sense, this experience, that it was folded in on itself, so that the aliens didn't have to come from very far. They're right next to us. The space got folded up so that the two realities were basically touching, which I thought was an interesting, hypothesis. So as long as they could be right next door to us in another dimension, they could also be on Earth, or under the water, or in another, parallel dimension existing, right with us.
Mm-hmm. And it just makes me think of a couple follow-up questions, but I do want to get to this question because it was related to the last one. Eve is asking, is anyone compartmentalizing abduction experiences for study? For example, common denominators among shared experiences versus multiple experiences or individual abduction experiences?
It's another very good question. I am not up on the latest research. I think you would have to do research to find, people who are doing this kind of research. But it's a very good question to see, to look for an explanation of, first of all, who are the people who are getting, abducted, or who are reporting abduction experiences? How do they differ? And one of the people I quote in my book raised this question. Let's interview people who are not abducted or who don't have abduction experiences. Why don't they? What about the things that don't fit? People, including John Mack, often rejected those stories that didn't quite fit the template because they couldn't be put into his neat box. He later realized that was a mistake. But look at the outlying experiences, which are really interesting because they don't fit. There's really good research to be done, and what it is about these people who are experiencing this. I know there's research being done into brain function, what parts of the brain light up during abduction recollections. But the important thing to remember is it's not all happening inside the head. John Mack pretty much looked at that and rejected it because there was too much other evidence of there was, as I said, the scoop marks, other evidence of people disappearing during remembered abduction. A parent would be having an abduction experience, and child would go into the room to find her mommy or daddy, and they were gone. Hard to explain. So it's not just in the brain, but good research certainly remains to be done.
Yeah, and as far as I know, just the resources for people. Free is an organization out there, FREE, and I can't remember what it stands for. But also Kathleen Martin and Denise Stoner are two people who have done some inventories, besides who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Leo Sprinkle. And they all have books all out there with the inventories and what they discovered, which is along the lines of what you were talking about just a second ago. Coming back to ATIP 2 and your New York Times article, I think one of the interesting things that we've discovered as time has gone on is that $22 million was actually earmarked for a lot of topics that were much more fringe than just objects flying around in the sky. Topics that were related to Skinwalker Ranch, and a lot of different phenomena, cattle mutilations, abductions, and even, I'm sure you've seen this, that the Bigelow group working on this, Bass, had put out this statement anonymously through George Knapp that it's hard to even understand it. It's so strange and all these weird things that they were getting into. So that at least there's somewhat of an appetite, even within the government, it seems, to look into some of these topics that are considered more fringe.
Yeah, I mean, Robert Bigelow was the contractor for that, and Bass is out of business now. But Bass got a lot of the contracts to study this stuff. Unfortunately, what they did is not in the public domain, as far as I know. So we can't even get at that information, which is a big problem. But even the FOIA requests take years to process and don't produce the information that we want. So it's very difficult. And a lot of stuff is just stamped classified, and that's the end of it. You never see it again. So it would be nice to know, what government research went into that. You mentioned government research. A lot of government money went to Russell Targ and his Stanford research group, that institute, I guess, that did studies in remote viewing. Remarkable things that were explored there, how everybody seems to have this ability, but certain people have a more highly developed, they can see things, far distant away, behind the Iron Curtain, say. What was the Iron Curtain? They looked at Soviet installations that no spy plane could photograph. And later on, when they were able to photograph it, they found a remarkable resemblance between the images that remote viewers got and the photos that spy planes got. So government did put a lot of money into that. Then it pulled out and said that it produced nothing. That's why we're pulling out, but I don't believe that.
That would be a great topic for a future book.
Yeah. Russell Targ has written a bit about it, and he's become a good friend. And actually, John Mack was writing a book about Russell Targ's daughter, Elizabeth, who died of a brain tumor, and also seemed to reappear spiritually after she died. That was his last quest. John Mack was very much into afterlife experiences when he died. As a matter of fact, some people thought it was a little too good, a little too close, a little too good that he died just as he was studying afterlife experiences. But it's one of the many strange aspects to the whole story.
Mm-hmm. When you bring up remote viewing, it brings up another kind of concept that's related to your article. I've always felt and kind of argued is that Russell Targ did that work with Dr. Hal Puthoff, who also worked with Bigelow, who also worked with ATIP. My point being that, these people with this conspiracy idea, if you really look at the history, you see a group of scientists interested in more fringe topics and, taking this to the government in their government positions or their jobs working on government contracts. So it's more of a story of a small group of very motivated individuals who have been able to get the government to take these more fringe topics seriously occasionally.
Yeah, no, it's true, and they're brave. I mean, I said John Mack is very brave to bring this out. And also, by the way, Alejandro, to get this out of the way, because this comes up a lot, did the government ever get involved with John Mack? Did he ever feel pressured by the government or told not to, do certain research or whatever? And the answer is no. He said publicly that he was never approached by the government. The government had no interest in him or his work. So that conspiracy theory we can dispose of, that he was, pressured by the government one way or the other.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was going to say another question from the chat comes from Lou. Lou asks, does Mr. Blumenthal have an opinion as to the efficacy or reliability of hypnosis or of polygraph tests?
Well, those are two very different things. I think used, by well-trained practitioners, both hypnosis and polygraph have some use. As you know, polygraphs are not admitted in court because they're not scientifically sufficiently reliable. Hypnosis, again, is a tool, and in the right hands, it can be useful. Betty and Bonnie Hill were hypnotized by Dr. Ben Simon, who got a lot of so it's not just John Mack. I mean, Dr. Simon came up with a lot of information. He was certainly not a believer in the sense that he, came with preconceived ideas. He was astounded by Betty and Bonnie Hill's story. And some of it was conscious. He got from them, actual memories without hypnosis, and then he put them under hypnosis and got a lot more. In the end, he said he still didn't understand what it all amounted to, what had happened to them. So he's a very good witness because he's detached and scientifically rigorous. So I think hypnosis is a valuable tool. And those who say that, these hypnotists, they just plant ideas in people, there were actual studies that John Mack dealt with as to how much an idea can be implanted that is totally untrue. And the way he, came out on it is these experiences were so central to a person. They were not implantable. Let's put it that way. They could not be explained as the suggestions of a hypnotist.
Mm-hmm. And I feel personally that you don't even have to draw a conclusion to identify that this is a matter or psychological phenomena that should be taken seriously, and that there are so many people experiencing it. It's affecting people's lives. And for that reason alone, we should try to explore what might be going on here. Carl Jung, for instance, talking about archetypes, talked about how our beliefs in UFOs and aliens are also could be representing these archetypes and could be other things going on. But at the same time, he was definitely an advocate for UFO research because he felt something was really going on.
Folklorists are always pointing out to the stories throughout history of experiences that were written off as fantasies, fairy tales and things like that, that turn out to have a correspondence with things happening, in today. But, I want to mention something else. As I say in my book, in 1992, there was a conference at MIT on alien abduction, and MIT was not the sponsor because MIT, wouldn't be the sponsor of a alien abduction conference, but it allowed use of one of its facilities, and it brought together atomic physicists and psychologists, psychiatrists, medical people, folklorists, theologians, and they all grappled with this mystery of what was happening to these people. And it's a very learned process that they went through, and they produced a book called Alien Discussions, which is on the bookshelf behind me, a big thick book of the transcripts of the weeks of proceedings. So anybody who wants to delve into this field and say it's all nonsense or these people are crazy or I have the answer, I know exactly what happened, it was sleep apnea, they need to read the actual testimony of the experts who themselves were mystified. And these were people on a very high level of scientific achievement. And they were mystified as we remain mystified today. There is no answer. But as I say, we know what it isn't. And it's not just a simple explanation of mental illness or nightmares or fabrication, all these things people talk. So it's a serious subject that needs to be seriously looked at.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Anthony. He says, would one of the reasons for the official government study of paranormal phenomena be because the Russians were studying it too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Russians are, I think, ahead of us in many of these areas of research. First of all, under their system, they don't have to explain everything to the people. There's a lot more secrecy there. And under an autocratic system that existed, under Stalin and now again under Putin, the government can do pretty much what it wants without explaining to people. In our country, politicians are held accountable, so they're much more wary. But the Russians have been, by all accounts, a leader in investigating, psychological phenomena. They've made a lot of, progress in understanding paranormal, activity. I think that I would venture to say they're ahead of us in that field, just because they seem to be able to move more easily. And they're smart. They realize there is something to be, investigated there. They're certainly involved in the search for technology that we're searching for, technology of UFOs, Chinese, I'm sure the same. So the answer is absolutely yes.
That brings up a topic that was in that Politico article that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I think the DOD, in their defense, have brought this up. It's a very shaky ground for them to be able to talk on this topic a whole lot because of kind of some of these counterintelligence issues, in that, we don't want them to know what we know, and we don't want them to know what we know about what they know and about what they're doing. And in some of these situations, there'll definitely be gray areas where we don't want to admit that we knew what that was. So we can't say anything about it. And those are some kind of genuinely sticky places where it is difficult for them to share information.
Yeah, no, I think it's legitimate to say that there's certain things. Look, we pay our government to protect us, and one way they protect us is to keep secrets. If everything that the government knew about advanced technology and our ongoing research were public, it would be open to our adversaries as well, who don't share information as freely as we do. So I think that's legitimate. But there's got to be a line drawn between, taking the people into their confidence. I mean, it's our government, it's our country, it's our airspace, it's our everything. So we have a right to know within reason what's going on, even if certain things can't be publicly shared. The worst thing, of course, is the disinformation that the government engaged in, making stuff up, altering documents so that now you don't know whether you're looking at a legitimate document or something that's been tinkered with for a reason. It's really destroyed the faith you can have in documents when you do research into this area. The government engaged in very nefarious activities to discredit UFO research early on in the 50s. They said it was a communist plot, or people should be investigated for communism who were interested in UFOs. So there's some really ugly aspect, not to speak of MK Ultra and the mind-altering experiments that they performed on unsuspecting Americans, which was a heinous chapter.
Mm-hmm. And what they did with you all, with their article, and with Lou Elizondo more recently, I think, in the falsehoods that they put out there. Nick Pope, who used to work for the UK government, called it dirty tricks, spin and dirty tricks, and it seems to have been somewhat effective, because those early denials put doubt into the veracity of the article, and some people never really recovered from that.
It's true that the Defense Department at one point, a spokesman, I don't want to say the whole department, but a spokesperson for the DOD said that Lou Elizondo was not who he represented himself to be. He never worked for the department, or he never headed ATIP, things like that, which were really destructive because it hurt him. It undermined credibility. We know that we're satisfied that we were accurate. We know who he is. His record speaks for itself. He was a patriot. He worked very hard in different capacities for the government. He did what he said he did. Our stories are accurate, and yet they did sow confusion and disbelief.
Mm-hmm. If you were consulted, and you're the type of person that should be consulted, and the UAP task force said, okay, well, we want to do good by the media and the public. What would be your advice to them?
Wow. Well, that's a total hypothetical because I don't think they'd ever come to me. But
Well, they should.
I would be very interested in, documenting some of these incidents. We hear stories about them all the time. What was seen, by pilots, by crew members of Navy ships. We hear stories anecdotally that there's, a lot of really fascinating material out there that, for example, and we get bits and pieces of it. We did an interview with Dave Fravor, a pilot, who encountered these Tic Tacs, so-called, these giant white unidentified flying objects. And at one point, he told us, and he's said since then, that he flew low over the water in his jet, and he saw a disturbance under the water, and one of these objects seemed to be hovering over the water over something under the water. And that was astounding because it suggested, as since become a little better known, these objects seem to operate regardless of medium, air, water, so it gave a whole new twist to the whole UFO question, where these things are operating. And people can sort of imagine them flying in the sky, but underwater. So I'd like to hear more of these incidents, whether we can explain them or not.
Question from the chat. Are you planning on following up? This is from Stephen, by the way. Thanks for the question, Stephen. Are you planning on following up on your New York Times article regarding crash retrievals? And did you have pushback from the editors?
Yeah, we're always interested in expanding the story. That's obviously something that's not going away. So the answer is yes. We were hoping to follow up. When you say pushback from the editors are always skeptical, especially in a field like this. I'm not going to say these stories, fall into the paper easily. Editors are there to raise questions, to make you, come up with solid information. I'm a Times veteran, so I kind of know, I anticipate what the editors are going to ask. So I'm not surprised when they say they want more backup or so. So I don't think it's fair to describe their reaction as pushback. I think they were doing what editors always do. And reporters always want to write more. Editors say include more information and cut it back. They say it has to be shorter with more information. So there's always a process that goes through. But look, I've had that experience with articles I've written on the mafia, on the Holocaust, on organized crime, corrupt politicians. So very often. So I wouldn't say, it's a little more difficult when you're dealing with a subject like this, but not much.
And then someone else is asking about the Times, if there's been an article that they've published taking a serious look at John Mack.
Well, in his time, yes. Actually, when he wrote his first book, Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens, in 1994, the first interview he gave was to the New York Times Magazine. And the Times was not always particularly respectful of John Mack. They were critical. They were snarky at times, I could say. They covered him a lot because he was a newsmaker, and he was very charismatic, by the way. He was a tall, blue-eyed magnet for men and women. I mean, everybody seemed drawn to him. He knew how to talk to people. He was a natural on the talk shows, very open, almost to a fault. He was a bit naive, really, about what he told reporters. He would sit with a reporter and say, I don't know, should I bring up psychedelic drugs? Maybe not. So other people might be more cautious dealing with the media, but that wasn't his style. So anyway, he did, he was treated, he was written up a lot by the Times and other publications, but not always, worshipfully, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of an interesting, might be an interesting kind of insider media question. They're just observing, while say it the way that they've said. Given that U.S. conservative-leaning outlets seem to enjoy covering the UAP subject, what is holding back larger left-leaning media outlets from covering the topic? I would totally not necessarily agree with his framing of left and right, but certainly, for example, Fox News seems to be covering the topic more than other outlets.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Maria Bartiromo interviewed Rubio the other day. Tucker Carlson is a big UFO fan. Obviously, he's interviewed me, interviewed Leslie, and he interviewed Radcliffe. It's an interesting question. I wish the other media were more open to reporting in this area. I don't know why it's Fox. Maybe it's the one thing that is not political that they can't be faulted on. Mm-hmm. It is an interesting question. What is it about UFOs that attract Fox? But it would be nice if that became a pattern elsewhere.
Rodrigo, a longtime listener, great participant, he's asking, what convinced you on this topic?
Oh, well, I don't want to, say I'm totally convinced one way or the other, because I think my book shows that I kind of stay out of I keep my opinion to myself through most of the book. And I disclose it at the end, and maybe it'd be a spoiler alert to tell you what that is. I'm going to make you buy the book to find out how I come out at the end. But it's no secret to say that in following John Mack's career and his reasoning, I was quite persuaded by the rigor of his process. He talked to a lot of people. I put the word hard science in the subtitle of the book because I don't turn my back on science. I subject some of the claims that are made about abduction to scrutiny by outside voices and intellects. And through that all, I did come away convinced that John Mack was rigorous, that what he found persuasive, as I said, the fact that so many stories were similar, that people had no incentive to make it up, that they weren't insane, that it happened to small children, that there were marks of UFO landings, sometimes outside the house, that they could find afterwards. The grass was pushed down and trees clipped off, and that people had these unexplained scoop marks. All these things added together, not one by itself, but all these things added together argued for something happening. Again, we don't know exactly what. Something real on some level is probably the best way to put it. So that's what convinced me. That I looked over his research. None of the skeptics that came up in the course of his efforts, or that I've consulted since then, have come up with anything remotely like a hypothesis that's convincing. Nobody has the answer. It remains a mystery. But I think Mack pulled together very well all the factors that help you reach a conclusion that something somehow happened to these people.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're running out of time, so I do want to wrap things up here, but I want to ask you, we had mentioned at the beginning another Harvard professor who's made news in the topic of aliens, and that is, of course, Dr. Avi Loeb, who is retired, in charge of the astronomy department there. What are your takes from kind of this media and science frenzy that's occurred with him insisting that, the possibility of that interstellar visitor, Oumuamua, could have possibly been alien technology? He's pretty convinced that that is a strong possibility.
Well, I read the book. I followed his reasoning. He says that the path that this object took could not be explained naturally. It sped up at one point. He thinks it might have had some solar sail that propelled it, the data did not conform with what would be expected of a natural object. In other words, an asteroid or a hunk of rock or whatever. And of course, other scientists differ with him. And I find his experience similar to Mack's in the sense that he was bucking the establishment. He still is. And he finds the world, the world of scientific society rather closed-minded. He argues for more openness, that the scientists he finds, and Mack found too really afraid or shy to challenge conventional thinking. They go for what everyone's going for. They don't set out on their own path and check out things for themselves that are really troubling. They're afraid to raise hackles of the scientific establishment. So I find his situation rather similar, and they overlapped at Harvard, Avi Loeb and John Mack. So I don't know to what extent Avi Loeb wants to be identified with John Mack. It's a different thing. Avi Loeb's talking about a hunk of material or, intelligent made object, and John Mack was talking about people abducted by aliens. So, they're rather different. But Harvard has a whole history of unconventional research going back to William James and his, paranormal experiments and seances. So that was 100 years ago, and he's well respected at Harvard. So Harvard should be respectful of people doing unconventional research.
All right. So I've brought up the book again, The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. You can get it here at Ralph Blumenthal's website or on Amazon. And do you have any future projects that we can look forward to you're working on?
Well, I'm very much involved in this book now, and appearing on shows and talking about it. So I haven't begun to think of my next project. I do periodic stories for the New York Times, so I'll probably come across a few things. But this will keep me busy for a while.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been wonderful. It's great to talk to you. Hopefully, we can do this again in the future. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Alejandro, a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.